My name is Pamela, and I'm 34 years old. 2 weeks before we were supposed to leave for Greece, I was sitting at the kitchen table watching my mother sort through the printed itinerary she loved so much. She had highlighted restaurant reservations, circled villa check-in times, and folded the pages neatly like this trip was something fragile that might fall apart if she didn't hold it together with ink and paper. I remember thinking how strange it was that she looked so happy, how relieved, like this vacation meant more to her than just sun and scenery. The plan had been simple. We were all going. My parents, my brother, and me. A family trip. The first real one since I'd started running a third of the family business and stopped being treated like the kid who helps out and started being treated like the person who kept things afloat. At least that's what I thought. I'd paid for the villa in full, not because I wanted control, but because my father had insisted it was easier if one person handled the booking. He said they'd send me their share later. They never did, but I didn't press it. I told myself this trip wasn't about money. It was about reconnecting. About reminding ourselves we were still a family outside of invoices and contracts and long workdays. That afternoon, without warning, my mother reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Her touch wasn't gentle, it was deliberate. She said, "You don't belong on this trip, it's for family." I didn't respond right away because I wasn't sure I'd heard her correctly. The words didn't fit the moment. They didn't fit anything. I waited for her to clarify, to laugh, to explain herself away. She didn't. My brother was leaning back in his chair, scrolling on his phone, completely uninterested until that moment. He didn't even look up when he added, "Yeah, it would be embarrassing if you went." That was it. No argument, no raised voices, no justification, just a decision they'd clearly made long before that afternoon. I nodded once, not because I agreed, but because I understood something in that moment that I'd been avoiding for years. They didn't see me as part of the family anymore. I was useful, I was convenient, but I wasn't wanted. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I smiled when spoken to. I answered questions. I pretended I wasn't replaying those 2 sentences over and over in my head. That night, when everyone retreated to their own homes, I opened my laptop and logged into my airline account. The tickets were in my name. The villa reservation was in my name. I hovered over the cancel button longer than I thought I would. Not because I felt guilty, but because I needed to be sure. This wasn't revenge. This was alignment. If I didn't belong on the trip, neither did my money. I clicked cancel. The confirmation emails arrived instantly. The refund processed within the hour. I closed the laptop and went to bed without telling anyone. At 9 a.m. the next morning, my phone rang. It was my father. He didn't say hello. He shouted. He accused me of ruining everything, of destroying months of planning, of taking away the one good thing they had to look forward to as a family. I listened without interrupting. When he finally paused, I told him calmly that they could still go. They just needed to pay for it themselves. Then I hung up. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Because what I didn't understand yet was that the trip wasn't the fight. The trip was just the excuse. They weren't angry that I canceled Greece. They were angry that I reminded them I still had power. I thought canceling the trip would force an uncomfortable but necessary reset. I thought it would make them pause, maybe even reflect. Instead, it flipped a switch. They didn't come back to the table to talk. They went around me. The silence after that phone call felt deliberate, like a tactic rather than an emotion. My mother didn't text. My father didn't follow up. My brother, however, made sure I knew exactly how little my absence mattered. He started sending messages the same evening, not outright hostile at first, just small barbs wrapped in humor, screenshots of flight searches, links to villas with captions like, "Still going," and "Son's waiting." One photo showed a balcony overlooking the sea, tagged with family trip, as if the word itself were a closed door. I didn't respond. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. 2 days later, the first crack appeared where I didn't expect it. One of our longest-standing suppliers called me mid-morning. His voice sounded careful, like he was stepping onto thin ice. He asked if everything was okay because my father had told him I was taking some personal time and wouldn't be handling orders for a while. I told him that wasn't true. He hesitated, then said he'd been instructed to deal only with my father or my brother going forward. I hung up and stared at my phone, a slow cold spreading through my chest. I called another supplier. Same story. I tried logging into our ordering system later that afternoon and was greeted by a message saying my access had been temporarily suspended due to administrative changes. No warning, no explanation, just a lockout. That was the moment it stopped being about feelings. They weren't trying to punish me for canceling a vacation. They were trying to erase me from the business. The next call came from a client we'd worked with for years. He asked, casually but pointedly, if it was true that I'd been taking more than my share of the profits. The accusation landed like a slap. I'd never even been whispered about in that way before. I told him it wasn't true. He said he hoped so, but the doubt in his voice stayed with me long after we hung up. By the end of the week, 3 regular contracts stopped returning my calls. Our office manager, who had always greeted me warmly, suddenly couldn't meet my eye when I stopped by. My parents ignored every text I sent asking what was going on. My brother posted a picture of the 3 of them at a restaurant, captioned "Family Night" with a heart emoji, like they were auditioning for normalcy. I had been erased, cleanly and efficiently. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table, replaying the last few days with painful clarity. They hadn't reacted emotionally. They'd reacted strategically. They had decided that if I wouldn't play my role quietly, they would remove me from the board altogether. What they forgot was that the business didn't belong to them alone. On paper, I owned exactly 1/3 of everything. More importantly, many of the relationships that kept us profitable existed because of me. I'd negotiated them, maintained them, protected them. They weren't interchangeable pieces. They were living threads. And if pulled carefully, they would unravel the picture my parents were trying to preserve. I didn't move right away. The worst mistakes are made in anger, and anger was everywhere. Instead, I stayed quiet. I didn't defend myself. I didn't confront anyone. I let my parents believe their story was working, that I was shrinking, licking my wounds, backing away. While they staged unity, I made lists. I mapped out every contract that required my signature, every lease that needed unanimous approval, every client who had trusted me personally. I knew where the cracks were because I'd helped build the structure, and if they wanted to turn this into a war, I wasn't going to rush into it blind. The first thread I pulled was a logistics contract we'd secured 2 years earlier, worth 6 figures annually. The owner had signed only because of me. I met him for lunch and told him calmly that I didn't want his company caught in what was about to become an ugly family dispute. I didn't ask him to choose sides. I gave him the truth and the option to walk away. By the end of the week, the contract was dissolved. Next came the property. Our second location was running on a lease due for renewal. Both my signature and my father's were required to lock it in. I visited the landlord myself and told him I wouldn't be agreeing to the renewal. He nodded, already sensing instability, and said he'd start looking for a new tenant. That location was a pressure point. Losing it would ripple through operations. I knew they'd feel it. Then I turned to the people who mattered most, 2 of our oldest clients. Over coffee, I told them exactly what had happened. No dramatics, no embellishment, just facts. Both thanked me for my honesty and decided to move their accounts elsewhere. They didn't want to be collateral damage in a family implosion. I knew the phone call was coming. 2 days later, my father rang. His anger this time was sharper, more controlled. He demanded to know what I thought I was doing. I told him, word for word, that I was fixing a problem. Then I ended the call before he could respond. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reminding them I wasn't an accessory they could discard when I became inconvenient. The shockwaves hit faster than I expected. By Monday morning, 2 employees had quit without notice. I trained them myself. They didn't need to explain why they were leaving. By lunch, a client called to confirm whether I'd stepped away voluntarily, repeating my father's version of events. That afternoon, our accountant phoned, confused and uneasy, explaining that my parents and brother had tried to remove me from certain accounts without unanimous approval. Then came the letter, heavy paper, formal language, accusations of misappropriation of company resources, and a threat of legal action if I didn't step down voluntarily. I laughed at first. Every transaction was documented, every cent accounted for. But lawsuits aren't about truth, they're about pressure. That evening, a longtime supplier named Carlos called me quietly. He told me he'd overheard my brother at a restaurant bragging about freezing me out completely, about replacing me with a new partner. And then, almost as an afterthought, Carlos said something that made my stomach drop. He said my brother had hinted they might dig into my personal life to find something they could use. That crossed the line. I sat at my desk that night, the legal letter in front of me, my phone on silent, and understood with perfect clarity that this was no longer a family dispute, it was an attempt to destroy me. And if they wanted to play without limits, I wasn't going to keep fighting with one hand tied behind my back. Once Carlos told me my brother was talking about digging into my personal life, the rules changed. There's a difference between fighting over money and deciding to make someone feel unsafe in their own skin. I sat there that night with the legal letter in front of me and realized they weren't trying to win an argument anymore. They were trying to scare me into disappearing. So I stopped waiting for permission. I didn't respond to the letter. I didn't call my parents. I didn't warn anyone. I went back to something I'd learned early in the business, something my father himself had taught me before he forgot I was ever his student. When people are panicking, they make mistakes. When they think they've cornered you, they get sloppy. I let them believe that. For the next week, I stayed quiet. I didn't show up at the office. I didn't correct the rumors. I let my parents and brother tell anyone who would listen that I was unstable, emotional, difficult. I let them frame me as the problem employee who couldn't handle being left out of a family holiday. Every lie they told made them more comfortable, and every ounce of that comfort made them easier to read. Behind the scenes, I worked. The business was more tangled than they realized. Over the years, I'd kept copies of everything: contracts, correspondence, old deal memos, and not because I planned to use them, but because I'd learned not to trust verbal assurances. I pulled an old hard drive from storage, one I hadn't opened in years, and started going through archived emails late into the night. That's when I found it. 10 years earlier, when we'd bought out our former partner, I'd been young and only partially involved. I remembered the meetings vaguely, remembered being told everything was handled, remembered trusting that the paperwork was clean. But the files told a different story. My parents hadn't paid their share outright. They'd taken a private loan from one of my father's golf buddies, a man named Richard, who ran a small investment group. The loan was secured against their shares of the company. And there it was, buried in the clauses they never thought I'd read closely. If the lender believed the business was at risk, he could demand full repayment immediately. If they couldn't pay, ownership would transfer to him. My share was untouched. I had paid my portion in full all those years ago. I sat back in my chair and felt something cold and steady settle into place. They had been threatening me with lawyers, with rumors, with intimidation, while standing on a trapdoor they'd forgotten existed. I didn't celebrate. I didn't rush. I called Richard the next morning. I didn't threaten him. I didn't exaggerate. I told him calmly that the business was unraveling, that key contracts were dissolving, that internal leadership was unstable, and that his investment was exposed. I told him if he wanted to protect himself, he should act now. There was a pause on the line. Then he said, almost casually, "You're telling me I should pull the plug?" I said yes. 3 days later, my parents were served with formal notice. 30 days to repay the loan in full. I didn't hear from them immediately. Instead, my brother showed up at my apartment just after midnight, pounding on the door like he was trying to break it down. When I opened it, he was pacing, eyes bloodshot, words tumbling over each other in anger. He accused me of messing with things I didn't understand. He told me I was destroying the family. He said I'd gone too far. I told him I'd read the loan agreement line by line years ago, while he was out celebrating a promotion. When I said Richard's name, he froze. No denial, no bluff. Just silence. That was the moment he understood this wasn't a scare tactic. This was an endgame. The next few weeks were chaos I watched from a distance. My mother called old friends, former colleagues, anyone she thought might have money. Most made excuses. A few didn't bother to answer. Losing major contracts had already damaged their reputation. Now the word was out that something was wrong. My father met with potential investors. Meetings were canceled. Follow-ups never came. Every door they tried opened a crack and then quietly closed. When my father finally called me, his voice was flat, tired. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He asked what I wanted. I told him the truth. I wanted them out of the business completely. Every share, every right. No negotiations. He said we'd talk about it. I told him there was nothing left to talk about. Then I hung up. The 30 days became a countdown I didn't have to watch. People brought me updates without me asking. My mother showing up uninvited to lunches, trying to pitch temporary investment opportunities. My brother telling anyone who would listen that they had a plan, that I'd regret crossing them. On the 29th day, Richard called me. He said they hadn't paid a cent. The deadline would expire the next morning, and he would be taking their shares as collateral. I told him the moment the transfer was official, I'd buy them. 3 weeks later, I sat in a conference room with a folder of documents in front of me and signed my name until my hand ached. When I finished, it was done. I had gone from owning a third of the business to owning all of it. There was no shouting, no confrontation, no family meeting, just signatures and silence. The first thing I did was change the locks on every company property. Security was instructed to turn away anyone not on the approved list. My parents and brother were not on it. The second thing I did was send an official notice through the company attorney. Short, professional, final. They were no longer permitted on the premises or to act on behalf of the company. After that, nothing. No calls, no messages, no apologies. Just absence. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong again. For a few days after the ownership transfer, the world went strangely quiet. Not peaceful, not resolved, just muted, like the air after a storm when you're waiting to see what's been knocked loose. I ran the business the way I always had, except now I didn't have to check my shoulder for sabotage. Clients started calling back. A few contracts returned. The book stabilized faster than I expected. On paper, I'd won. That's when the letters arrived. They were hand-delivered, stacked neatly on my desk by the office manager, who looked as confused as she was worried. No return addresses, no logos, just envelopes with my name written carefully across the front. The first one I opened was from the county zoning office. Multiple complaints had been filed against our main warehouse: excessive noise, traffic congestion, improper waste disposal. None of it was true. None of it mattered. Investigations move whether accusations are real or not. The second envelope was worse. A notice from the Department of Labor. An anonymous report alleging underpayment of staff, manipulated hours, falsified payroll records. I knew every claim was false, but I also knew how long audits take and how much damage they do while they're happening. The third envelope had no letterhead at all. Just one sentence, centered on the page in bold type. "You didn't win. This isn't over." I didn't need a signature. The handwriting on the envelope told me everything. It was my brother's. That afternoon, my attorney called with news that confirmed my worst suspicion. Several of our biggest clients had been contacted anonymously. The caller claimed I was under federal investigation for fraud and that my ownership of the company was in question. 2 contracts were already on hold pending clarification. They couldn't touch the business from the inside anymore, so they were trying to strangle it from the outside. Regulators, rumors, reputation. They were aiming to make me radioactive. I sat in my office long after everyone left, lights off, city noise bleeding through the windows, and felt something settle into place. They hadn't learned anything. Losing the company hadn't humbled them. It had only stripped away their last restraint. If they wanted to play the rumor game, I wasn't going to answer with whispers. I started with paper. I went back through the files I'd kept over the years, not just contracts, but the things people never expect to matter later. Old receipts, credit card statements I'd once been asked to help reconcile, tax filings that never quite sat right but weren't my responsibility at the time. Patterns emerged fast when you knew what you were looking for. Family vacations billed as client retreats, clothing purchases logged as uniform expenses, my brother's sports car registered under the company fleet despite never being used for work. One of our rental properties listed as corporate housing, while it functioned as a private getaway my parents visited twice a month. I didn't embellish, I didn't speculate, I organized. Then I sent a packet to the IRS and the state tax authority. Anonymous, documented, clean. I let the evidence speak for itself. Next, I handled the public front. I reached out to a reporter at the local business journal, someone I'd helped years earlier with a supply chain story. I didn't give my name. I told him I had verifiable information about a prominent family business with questionable financial practices and a history of pushing out partners. I gave him just enough to start digging. 4 days later, the first article ran. No names, no accusations, just questions. But in our city, everyone knew who it was about. My phone filled with messages from old acquaintances, not asking if it was true, but saying they'd suspected something for years. The last move was personal. I called 2 of my father's closest golf buddies, men he'd known since before I was born. I played dumb, asked if they'd heard anything about zoning complaints or labor investigations. By the end of the calls, I knew those conversations would ripple through the club by morning. Social standing mattered to my parents almost as much as money. Within a week, they stopped showing up. My brother didn't go quiet. He left a voicemail that was mostly yelling and threats, promising I'd destroyed the family forever. I deleted it without saving. They wanted a war. Now they had one they couldn't win. And the truth was, I wasn't even angry anymore. Anger burns hot and fast. This felt colder, cleaner. I wasn't trying to punish them. I was removing every illusion they'd ever used to protect themselves. There was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to salvage. All that remained was fallout. By the time the investigations became public, I was already several steps removed emotionally. That surprised me more than anything else. I had expected triumph, or at least vindication. Instead, what I felt was distance, like I was watching someone else's life collapse through thick glass, muted and unreal. The zoning office showed up first. Clipboards, cameras, fluorescent vests. They walked the perimeter of the warehouse, took measurements, asked polite but pointed questions. Everything checked out. Then labor auditors arrived, requesting payroll records, timesheets, contracts. I handed everything over without hesitation. I had nothing to hide, and they could tell. Calm unnerves people who are looking for cracks. Meanwhile, the story in town shifted. Quietly at first. The article in the business journal sparked conversations, then follow-ups. A second piece ran, this one more specific. Still careful, still factual, but the dots were close enough together that anyone paying attention could connect them. The phrase, family-run operation, appeared alongside internal disputes and financial irregularities under prior leadership. Clients who had put contracts on hold called back, embarrassed, apologetic. They said they'd been told alarming things, but now they were seeing a different picture. I didn't gloat. I didn't explain. I just thanked them and moved on. My parents didn't call. My brother didn't show up again. The threats stopped, replaced by something more dangerous to people like them: irrelevance. A month later, a mutual acquaintance mentioned seeing my parents at a restaurant we used to frequent on Sundays. They were sitting in silence, pushing food around their plates, not arguing, not laughing, just existing beside each other like strangers who shared a history, but nothing else. My brother wasn't with them. He'd moved out of town, apparently. No job announcement, no farewell post, just gone. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing that. I felt confirmation. 6 weeks after everything ended, I realized I hadn't checked my phone obsessively in days. No waiting for the next shoe to drop. No bracing for impact. The silence had settled into something livable. I ran the business the way I always wanted to. Transparent, steady, without hidden agendas. Employees relaxed. Meetings got shorter. Decisions got clearer. The company didn't just survive, it stabilized. One afternoon, my office manager brought me coffee and said, "It feels different now, lighter." She was right. I never heard directly from my parents again. No apology, no attempt at reconciliation. And oddly, I was grateful for that. Some endings don't need speeches, they need space. I passed the old family restaurant one evening on my way home. Through the window, I saw my parents again, this time with another couple, smiling faintly, performing normalcy for whoever was across the table. I paused for a moment, watching them, and felt nothing. No anger, no grief, no longing. I turned and kept walking. The business continued to grow. New contracts came in. New partnerships formed. People stopped whispering and started asking questions the right way. And every once in a while, someone would say, "You handled that situation with your family incredibly well," like it was a compliment. I never corrected them. Because what I'd learned was this: winning doesn't always look like celebration. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like choosing not to carry what was never yours to begin with. I didn't ruin a family. I refused to be erased by one. My name is Pamela, and walking away was the first decision I made that belonged entirely to me.